I'm Patricia Ezechie, and this is Proactive Empowered Careers, a space for thinking about careers differently, not as something separate from who you are, but as an expression of you and the life you want to live. Hello everyone, and welcome back. If you've been listening to the last few episodes, you might have noticed a thread running through them. We've talked about that question that starts to surface. We've talked about feeling stuck. We've talked about outgrowing things and about the sense that you might be becoming someone slightly different from who you were before. And when we begin to experience these things, other questions start to come to the surface. Questions like, what do I want now? And that might be different from what I wanted before. Another question might be, how do I know what's right for me? Not what makes sense on paper, and not what other people advise, but what actually feels right to me. And to begin to understand what feels right, we need to know how to listen to ourselves. And for many of us, that's something we've never really been taught or learned to do, which is so interesting when you think about it. Because we spend years learning how to gather information about ourselves from outside of ourselves, because that's how we've learned to validate ourselves. So when something feels off in our careers, our instinct is usually to look outward. We look outward for answers, we look outward for advice, for reassurance, and even for the next role. Or we look to feedback, to other people's experiences, to what worked before, to what makes sense on paper. And all that has value. But we spend so much less time learning how to notice what's happening inside of ourselves, what our reactions are, how our energy is changing, our hesitation, what excites us, what causes us a sense of ease or discomfort, what we actually think, and what we feel. Signals that are there every day, but we so easily override them and often do. And this is something I see again and again. Most of us look outward for answers before we've learned how to look inward at ourselves. And even when we do begin to look inward, it's not always easy to trust what we're seeing or hearing or feeling. And the reason for that is that we've often learned to give more weight to what comes from outside of ourselves, to other people's views, to other people's certainty, to what's visible, to what's measurable, to what's easily validated. So our internal signal isn't necessarily quiet. It's just competing with all that external output, with expectations and timelines and financial pressures and professional cultures and family narratives and a constant presence of other people's lives and choices through social media. And perhaps most powerfully of all is other people's certainty about what we should be doing, what the right next move should be, what success should look like. And when all of that is in the mix and is present, our own signal starts to feel really faint. And because it's faint, it becomes easy to dismiss, easy to second guess, and easy to talk ourselves out of. And the interesting thing is that listening to yourself isn't always about trying to get new ideas and new insight. It's about creating enough space for your own signal to come through more clearly through all that external noise. Because when your attention has been pulled outward for such a long time, your internal voice doesn't disappear, it just gets harder to hear. And part of this process is learning to recognize that voice again, to hear it again, to create space for it to come through. And this is where it can become a little more complicated. Because not everything that we notice within ourselves is a clear signal. If only it was that simple. When we talk about listening to ourselves, we're not just talking about what we feel. We're also noticing what we think and what we sense and what we hear internally. And all of that can come through in different ways. And sometimes what shows up is a reaction. Something like fear, or old patterns, or conditioned ways of thinking and responding. Maybe an instinct to protect ourselves. And that's part of what makes listening to ourselves something that feels confusing. Because we might start to notice things, and we might hear something internally, but not be entirely sure what to do with it. We don't know what to trust, what to pay attention to, what really matters and what doesn't. And when we start to listen, we might find ourselves wondering, is this intuition or is this anxiety? Is this misalignment or am I tired? Is this a genuine desire for something or am I comparing myself to someone else? Because what we're hearing, we're not familiar with, so we're not clear as to whether we trust it. So you might want to think about listening to yourself less like receiving instructions and more like getting to know how your own internal signal shows up. And one way I've found really useful to think about this is this, that learning to listen to yourself is a relationship that you're developing, a relationship with yourself. And like any relationship, it develops over time, through paying attention, through being curious, through being patient, and through care. As you do all that, you start to notice patterns, things that might consistently energize you, the things that might drain you, the environments where you feel more like yourself, and the ones where you feel smaller, more contracted. And over time, those patterns become clearer, not because we've learned to analyze them perfectly, but because we've paid attention to them. And then when we start to begin to look at ourselves more closely, we start to notice the moments where we knew something and then we overrode it. We've all done it. We've said yes to things when we meant no. We've stayed longer when we knew something wasn't right. We've accepted something out of obligation. We've dismissed something exciting in ourselves as being unrealistic. We've minimized feelings of discomfort and put them off as being just temporary things. And we've dismissed possibility as something impossible for us, often for very understandable reasons. And those are reasons like wanting to belong, wanting to feel safe, for things to be practical, because you want to feel loyal, and because you want to feel comfortable. So when I talk about noticing these moments that we may have missed before, it's not about regret. It's about awareness, because awareness creates more choice, and choice creates more agency for the next time a situation arises. And this is where it can start to feel like something quite big, as though we're meant to become completely in tune with ourselves and start making life-changing decisions overnight. But actually, it's much simpler than that, and much more everyday than that. Because listening to yourself doesn't start with big decisions and big changes. It starts with creating space, with moments where you're not constantly doing or reacting or looking forward, and more moments of being. Because when there's a little space that we've created in our lives, we begin to hear what's already there. And from there, it begins very simply. By hearing what's already there, we might choose to rest instead of do. We might pause before we respond to something. We might begin to notice tension more. We might feel more able to follow a moment of curiosity when it arises. And we might allow ourselves to begin to feel relief without dismissing it when it comes up. Because allowing yourself to feel anything is so important in stopping ourselves from moving past these things too quickly, missing the signals, missing the information. It creates small moments where we become aware of our lived experience instead of always overriding it. And over time, those moments begin to build. And as they build, we begin to quietly strengthen that trust in ourselves. Because the thing about trusting yourself isn't something that you either have or you don't have. It's something that develops, and it develops through practice, through listening to yourself and responding to what you hear. Even in the smallest of ways, it doesn't have to be perfect, and even when you don't always get it right. Because the trust will grow through the experience of doing this, through trying and noticing and adjusting and trying again. Not just thinking about it and not just intending to do it, but through the repetition of always coming back to yourself again and again and again. And many of us discover that self-trust doesn't suddenly appear at big moments or big decisions. It grows gradually through that everyday listening. So here's something you might want to try this week. Once or twice a day, just pause. And when you pause, ask yourself, what am I thinking right now? And what am I feeling? Not what should I be thinking or what it means, just what's actually here. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? And notice, is it tired, engaged, irritated, interested, flat, curious, relieved, or what other word comes to you when you're listening? Whatever is true for you in that moment. And in that small act of noticing, we bring our attention back to ourselves, and that's all we're trying to do. And this is where all of this begins to connect back to our careers. Because when we understand ourselves more clearly, the opportunities around us begin to look different. Decisions begin to feel different. Less like puzzles that we have to solve, and more like something that we can sense our way through. We begin to recognize the environments that support us, the kind of work that feels meaningful, the pace that feels sustainable to us. We recognize what actually matters and what success really feels like for each of us. And over time, your career becomes less about what other people think and more about what feels right to you, more about what fits, and more about what allows you to become and stay aligned to who you really are. So as we finish this episode today, I want to leave you with this. Listening to yourself doesn't remove uncertainty, and it doesn't give you all the answers straight away. It doesn't make decisions clearer or obvious straight away either. But what it does do is change your relationship with uncertainty. Because instead of feeling disconnected from what's happening to you, you're part of it. You feel involved. You feel aware. Because you are aware. And that awareness changes how change feels in itself. Less like something you have to leap into, and more like something that you're moving through and experiencing. So in the next episode, we'll explore something that naturally follows from all of this. If you begin to hear yourself more clearly, how do you begin to trust what you hear? We'll talk about trusting yourself not as confidence, but as something quieter, something that develops over time and as you come to know and understand yourself better. So until then, have a really good week. Listen to yourself and take the very best care of yourself. This has been Proactive Empowered Careers. If today's episode resonated, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what comes next. And remember, your career isn't separate from who you are. It's an expression of you and the life you want to live.